On August 7, 1942, the sky over Guadalcanal was a chaotic tapestry of flak and fire. Saburō Sakai, Japan's most elite fighter pilot, banked his Mitsubishi A6M0 into what he thought was a group of unescorted Wildcat fighters. It was a fatal miscalculation. The targets were actually SBD Dauntless dive bombers, equipped with lethal rear-facing machine guns. As Sakai closed in for the kill, a .30 caliber bullet shattered his cockpit canopy and tore through his skull. The impact was catastrophic. The bullet entered the right side of his head, missing his brain by millimeters but destroying the vision in his right eye and sending shards of glass into his left. Blood poured down his face, blinding him instantly. His left side went numb, a terrifying sign of partial paralysis. The Zero, once an extension of his own body, began a sickening, uncontrolled plunge toward the Pacific Ocean. In that moment, the samurai of the sky was dead in the air. Most pilots would have accepted the inevitable. In the Bushido code-driven culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a heroic death, by crashing into the sea, was expected. But as the cool air rushed through the shattered glass of his cockpit, something in Sakai snapped back to life. He didn't want to be a ghost. He wanted to be a survivor. He pulled the stick back with his functioning right arm, leveled the plane just feet above the waves, and realized he was 560 miles away from his base at Rabaul. Between him and safety lay a vast, featureless expanse of ocean and nearly 5 hours of flying. He was alone, half-blind, and losing blood at a rate that should have caused him to black out within minutes. The mission was no longer about combat. It was a grueling, agonizing test of human endurance. To survive, Sakai would have to fight a battle against his own biology, slapping his wounds to stay awake and using the horizon he could barely see to guide him home. This wasn't just a flight. It was a 560-mile walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Saburō Sakai was not a pilot by accident. He was a product of one of the most brutal and unforgiving training regimes in the history of warfare. Born into a family descended from samurai, Sakai carried the weight of a warrior class that had been stripped of its swords but not its spirit. When he joined the Imperial Japanese Navy, he entered a world where the weak were literally beaten out of the service. Trainees were often struck with wooden oars for the slightest infraction, and the standards for the fighter pilot program were so high that out of thousands of applicants, only a handful would ever earn their wings. This environment forged a man of incredible physical and mental discipline. To sharpen his vision, Sakai was trained to spot stars in the daylight, a skill that required a level of ocular focus that seemed supernatural to Westerners. He spent hours practicing the feel of his Mitsubishi A6M0, learning to fly not by looking at his instruments, but by sensing the vibrations of the engine through the soles of his boots and the palms of his hands. By the time he arrived in the South Pacific, he was more than an ace. He was a technician of death who moved through the air with the grace of a calligrapher. Yet, despite the harshness of his upbringing, Sakai was known for a trait that was rare in the Imperial Navy: a deep, almost protective loyalty to his wingmen. He famously never lost a subordinate in combat, a record he prized more than his own kill count. He wasn't a reckless fanatic. He was a professional who understood the value of a life. This humanity was often at odds with the total war philosophy of his superiors, who viewed pilots as expendable cogs in a divine machine. His character was defined by this tension, the lethal efficiency of a samurai combined with a personal moral code that refused to celebrate the waste of life. When he was hit over Guadalcanal, it wasn't just his training that took over. It was this core, samurai, identity. To Sakai, dying in a crash was a failure of duty. Returning the plane and himself to his base was the ultimate act of discipline. He was the samurai of the sky, not because he sought death, but because he mastered the art of staying alive in a world that demanded he vanish. The flight from Guadalcanal back to Rabaul should have been a death sentence. As the adrenaline from the initial impact began to fade, a crushing, narcotic exhaustion settled over Saburō Sakai. His brain, starving for oxygen and reeling from the trauma of the bullet wound, desperately wanted to shut down. In aviation, this is the sleep of death, a gentle slide into unconsciousness that ends with a vertical dive into the Pacific. Sakai knew that if his eyelids closed for more than 5 seconds, they would never open again. To survive, Sakai turned his cockpit into a torture chamber. He doused his head with freezing water from his canteen, the liquid mixing with the congealing blood on his flight suit. When the cold wasn't enough, he used his one functional hand to reach up and slap his own open head wound. The white-hot flash of agony acted like a jumper cable to his nervous system, shocking him back into a state of jagged alertness. He repeated this cycle of self-mutilation for hours, choosing physical pain over the sweet, terminal release of sleep. Navigation was a nightmare of geometry and guesswork. He was blinded in his right eye, and the left was clouded by blood and glass shards. He couldn't read his compass clearly, nor could he see the horizon with any precision. He had to fly by the seat of his pants, feeling the slip and skid of the Zero through his hips. He navigated by the position of the sun, making mental calculations that would challenge a healthy navigator, let alone a man with a hole in his skull. Every few minutes, his vision would go completely black, and he would have to shake his head violently to clear the red mist. When the coast of New Britain finally appeared through the haze, it looked like a mirage. He had been in the air for nearly 5 hours. His fuel gauge was hovering on empty, and his body was in the final stages of shock. The ground crew at Rabaul watched in disbelief as a lone, battered Zero wobbled toward the runway. It didn't look like a landing, it looked like a controlled crash. But as the wheels touched the dirt, Sakai executed a perfect three-point landing. He didn't just return, he brought the Emperor's aircraft back intact. When the medics climbed onto the wing to pull him out, Sakai refused help until he had officially reported his mission to his commanding officer. He had flown 560 miles on pure, unadulterated will. The true crisis for Saburō Sakai didn't end when the wheels of his Zero touched the dirt of Rabaul. It was only shifting from a physical battle to a psychological one. When the medics reached him, they were horrified. The bullet had left a furrow in his skull that exposed the pulsing membrane of his brain. He was rushed to a field hospital where the surgeons faced a grim reality. They had to operate on his eyes to remove the shards of glass and metal, but they had no anesthesia. In a display of stoicism that would define his legend, Sakai refused to be restrained. He sat perfectly still, gripped the edges of the operating table, and remained silent as the surgeons cut into his face. He survived the surgery, but his world had fundamentally changed. He was sent back to Japan, partially blind and physically broken, to serve as an instructor. For a man whose entire identity was built on being the samurai of the sky, being grounded was a slow, agonizing death. However, the real crisis point was the moral collapse of the world he believed in. As 1944 arrived, Japan's military situation turned from desperate to suicidal. The Imperial Navy began implementing the kamikaze program, turning the nation's youth into human bombs. To Sakai, this was the ultimate betrayal of the samurai code. He believed a warrior should live to fight another day, to master his craft, and to protect his home. Seeing his young students, boys he had trained, being sent on one-way missions broke something inside him. He openly argued with his superiors, risking execution for insubordination, as he pleaded for them to stop wasting lives. He was eventually allowed back into a cockpit, despite his blindness in one eye. In one of the war's most incredible feats of skill, he survived a solo encounter with 15 U.S. Navy Hellcats, outmaneuvering all of them for 20 minutes until they ran low on fuel and had to leave. But there was no joy in the victory. He was a ghost flying among ghosts. He saw the firebombing of Tokyo, the destruction of his peers, and the total ruin of his country. By the time the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Sakai wasn't just fighting for Japan. He was fighting to keep his own humanity intact in an era of total madness. He had survived the bullet, the 560-mile flight, and the surgeon's knife, but now he had to survive the guilt of being the one who lived while a generation of his friends vanished into the sea. When the war ended in 1945, Saburō Sakai did not find peace in the surrender. He found a vacuum. The world he had been forged to defend was gone, replaced by an occupied nation and the bitter taste of defeat. He was a man whose hands were built for the control stick and the sword, yet he found himself in a Japan that no longer wanted warriors. To survive, he opened a printing shop, laboring in obscurity, but the ghosts of the Pacific never left him. The true resolution of Sakai's life began when he turned toward Buddhism. He became a devout pacifist, vowing never to kill another living creature, not even a mosquito. He realized that his survival on that 560-mile flight wasn't just a miracle of physics, but a second chance at a soul. He spent the rest of his life transforming from a samurai of the sky into a bridge between two worlds. In an era before the internet made global connection easy, Sakai reached out to his former enemies. He traveled to the United States, meeting the very pilots and tail gunners who had once tried to put a bullet in his head. In 1982, he had a legendary meeting with Harold "Lou" Jones, the SBD Dauntless tail gunner who is widely believed to have fired the shot that blinded him over Guadalcanal. Instead of animosity, there was an instant, unspoken bond between the two old men. They weren't Jap and Yankee anymore. They were two survivors of a storm that had swallowed most of their friends. They shook hands, shared a meal, and realized that the will to live they both possessed was a more powerful force than the ideologies that had sent them to war. Sakai's final years were spent as an author and a motivational speaker, preaching a message of reconciliation. He famously criticized the Japanese government for not being more transparent about the atrocities of the war, standing as a lone, brave voice of accountability. He died in 2000, at a U.S. Navy dinner at Atsugi Air Base, shortly after finishing a speech. He died among sailors and pilots, both American and Japanese, a warrior who had successfully navigated the longest and most difficult flight of all, the journey from hatred to forgiveness. The legacy of Saburō Sakai is the ultimate testament to the human spirit's refusal to break. In aviation circles, his 1942 flight remains the gold standard of endurance, a case study in what the brain can achieve when the body has already given up. But his historical legacy is more complex. He remains one of the few figures from the Imperial Japanese military who is held in high regard across the globe, not just for his 64 kills, but for his unwavering moral compass. He proved that being a samurai wasn't about the glory of death, but the dignity of life. By choosing to live, choosing to fly 560 miles through the red mist, and choosing to seek out his enemies in peace, he became a symbol of post-war healing. He taught the world that the greatest victory a soldier can achieve isn't shooting down an enemy, but turning an enemy into a friend.